Good morning. Till now we have studied about the conduction and the transmission of the nerve impulse. Today we are starting with the next topic, central nervous system. We know that the brain is the central information processing organ of the body, and it acts as a command and control system. It controls the voluntary movements, balance of the body, functioning of the important involuntary organs like lungs, heart or kidneys, etc. Thermoregulation, hunger, thirst, circadian rhythms of our body. Circadian rhythms are the 24-hour cycles of the body. Activities of several endocrine glands and human behavior, all these are controlled by the brain. It is also the site of processing of vision, hearing, speech, memory, intelligence, emotions and thoughts. So the human brain is well protected by a skull. Outside we know that the skull protects it, and the brain is covered by cranial meninges. So here we find the cranial meninges are there. Now these meninges, they consist of an outer layer which is called as dura mater. It is a very thin middle layer which is called as arachnoid mater, and an inner layer which is in contact with the brain which is called as pia mater. So the brain is divided into three major parts: forebrain, midbrain and hindbrain. So these are the various parts of the brain. This is the forebrain, this is midbrain and this is the hindbrain. Okay, some of this you have studied in your 10th class also. So let's talk about forebrain first. Forebrain consists of cerebrum. You can see here cerebrum. This whole part is cerebrum. The forebrain consists of cerebrum, thalamus and hypothalamus. So here we can find the thalamus and hypothalamus. So this whole part is the forebrain. So cerebrum forms the major parts of the human brain. So this is the cerebrum, and a deep cleft divides the cerebrum longitudinally into two halves, and which makes it left and right cerebral hemispheres. So it is divided into two halves: cerebral hemisphere, left and right side. So the hemispheres are connected by a tract of nerve fibers that is called as corpus callosum. So you can see here corpus callosum, which is connecting the two halves of the brain. Now the layer of the cell which covers the cerebral hemisphere is called as cerebral cortex. Okay, outermost the covering which is covering the cerebrum part. And the cerebral cortex is referred to as the grey matter due to its greyish appearance, and the neuron cell bodies, they are concentrated here, giving it the color. Cerebral cortex contains motor areas, sensory areas and large regions which are clearly sensory, sometimes neither sensory nor motor in origin, in function. So these regions are called as association centers. Okay, some regions here these are called as association centers. They are responsible for the complex functions like intersensory associations, memory and communications. So fibers of the tracts, they are covered with a myelin sheath which constitutes the inner part of the cerebral hemisphere, and they give it an opaque white appearance to the layer, and hence is called as the white matter. So the cerebrum wraps around the structure which is called as thalamus. You can see here thalamus. This is the thalamus, which is a major coordinating center for sensory and motor signaling. Another very important part of the brain is the hypothalamus. You can see this part, hypothalamus. It lies at the base of the thalamus, and the hypothalamus contains a number of centers which control body temperature, urge for eating and drinking, and it also contains several groups of neurosecretory cells which secrete hormones called hypothalamic hormones. So the inner part of the cerebral hemispheres and a group of associated deep structures called amygdala, hippocampus, etc. They form the complex structure which is called as the limbic lobe. Here, this part, it is called as the limbic lobe or limbic system. Along with the hypothalamus, it is involved in the regulation of sexual behavior, expression of emotional reactions, excitement, pleasure, rage, fear, motivation, etc. Okay, so this limbic system helps in doing that. Now, in continuation with the studying the structure of the brain, today we'll talk about midbrain and hindbrain. Midbrain is located between the thalamus, hypothalamus of the forebrain, and pons. You can see here this is the pons region, pons of the hindbrain. So this region is called as the midbrain. Midbrain, and a canal called as the cerebral aqueduct. You can see here cerebral aqueduct. Cerebral aqueduct passes through the midbrain, and the dorsal portion of the midbrain consists mainly of 4 round swellings or lobes, which are called as corpora quadrigemina. So these lobes, they are called as corpora quadrigemina. Now let's talk about the hindbrain. Hindbrain comprises of pons, cerebellum and medulla. Pons, cerebrum and medulla. This part, the medulla oblongata, the pons, they consist of fibrous tracts which connect different regions of the brain. Cerebellum, this part which is called as the cerebellum, it has a very convoluted surface, and it provides the additional space for many more neurons. And the medulla of the brain, this part, medulla of the brain is actually connected to the spinal cord, and the medulla contains centers which control respiration, cardiovascular reflexes and gastric secretions. So 3 major regions, they make up the brain stem: the midbrain, pons and the medulla oblongata, and this brain stem forms the connections between the brain and the spinal cord. Reflex section and reflex arc. We experienced a sudden withdrawal of a body part which comes in contact with the objects, and which are sometimes extremely hot, or they prick up a prick in the finger through a pin. All these, when you come in contact with the hot, cold, pointed, or animals that are scary or poisonous, the entire process of response of the peripheral nervous system stimulation, which occurs involuntarily, that is without peripheral nervous stimulation or conscious effort or thought, or requires the involvement of a part of the central nervous system, that is called as the reflex section. So the reflex pathway comprises at least one afferent neuron, which is a receptor, and one efferent neuron, which is an effector or exciter neuron, and they are arranged in a series. So the afferent neuron receives signals from the sensory organs, generally the sensory organs. The afferent neuron, this receives signals from the sensory organs and transmits the impulse through the dorsal nerve root into the central nervous system at the end of the spinal cord, and the efferent neuron then carries the signal from the central nervous system to the effector organs, and then the stimulus and the response, it forms a reflex arc as shown here, like in the when you just touch a hot object, or in a knee jerk, you always the mechanism of knee jerk reflex, or this when you touch the finger is touched by a source of heat, then all these reflex sections, they do happen in the body. Now let's talk about the sense organs, sensory receptors and processing. Now the sensory organs, they detect all type of changes in the environment and send appropriate signals to the sensory organs, to the central nervous system, So where all the inputs, they are processed and analyzed, and signals that they are sent to the different parts of the body through the centers of the brain. This is how we can sense the changes in the environment. So sensory organs, we smell things by our nose, taste by the tongue, hear by the ear, and see the objects by the eyes. So the nose contains mucus-coated receptors which are specialized for receiving the sense of smell, and these are called as olfactory receptors. So these are made up of olfactory epithelium, which consists of 3 kinds of cells. So the neurons of the olfactory epithelium, it extends from the outside environment directly into a pair of broad bean-shaped sized organs, which are called as olfactory bulbs, which have extensions in the brain limbic system, and both nose and tongue. They detect dissolved chemicals. The chemicals senses of the station, taste, and olfactory, smell, and similar other interrelated activities. So the tongue detects taste through the taste buds containing gustatory receptors, and with each taste of food or sip of drink, the brain integrates the different input from the taste buds and complex flavor is received. So now we'll be studying about the structure and functioning of the eye, that is the sensory organ for vision, and the ear, which is the sensory organ for hearing. So when we talk about eye, the adult human eyeball is a spherical structure, and the wall of the eyeball is composed of 3 layers. The external layer is composed of dense connective tissue and is called as sclera. The anterior portion of this layer is called as cornea. The middle layer, choroid, contains many blood vessels and it looks bluish in color, and the choroid is generally thin on the posterior 2/3 of the eyeball, and it becomes thick in the anterior part of the ciliary body. Here. So the ciliary body contains forward a form of a pigmented and opaque structure which is called as the iris, which is a visible colored portion of the eye. The eyeball contains a transparent crystalline lens which is held in place by ligaments and is attached by the ciliary body. In front of the lens, the aperture or the hole which is surrounded by iris, that is called as the pupil. The diameter of the pupil is regulated by the muscle fibers of the iris. The inner layer of the retina contains 3 layers of neural cells from inside to outside. These are ganglion cells, bipolar cells, and photoreceptor cells. There are 2 types of photoreceptor cells. These are rods and cones, and these cells contain light sensitive proteins which are called as photopigments, and the daylight or photopic vision or the color vision, they are the functions of the cones, and the scotopic vision is the functions of the rods. So the rods contain a purplish pigment which is called as rhodopsin or visual purple, which contains vitamin A. So in the human eye, there are 3 types of cones which possess their own characteristic photopigments and which respond to red, green, and blue lights. And the sensation of different colors, they are produced by various combination of these cones and these photopigments. And when these cones are stimulated equally, a sensation of white light is produced. So the optic nerves, here you can see optic nerves, they leave the cell and the retinal blood vessels and they enter a point medial to and slightly above the posterior part of the eyeball. Photoreceptor cells are not present in this region and hence it is called as the blind spot. At the posterior pole of the eye, lateral to the blind spot, there is a yellowish pigmented spot called macula luteae. Here. Macula luteae with a central pit which is called as the fovea. The fovea is a thinned portion of the retina where only the cones are densely packed. So it is a point where the visual activity is the greatest. So the space between the cornea and the lens is called as the aqueous chamber. This is aqueous chamber. And it contains a thin watery fluid called aqueous humor. And the space between the lens and the retina is called as the vitreous chamber, and it is filled with a transparent gel called as the vitreous humor. Now what is the mechanism of vision? The light rays which are visible wavelength, they are focused on the retina and through the cornea, and lens generates impulses in rods and cones. And the photosensitive compounds or photopigments in the human eye, which are opsin, which is a protein, retinal, it is an aldehyde of vitamin A, and the light induces the dissociation of this retinal from opsin, which results changes in the structure of the opsin. So this causes membrane permeability changes, and as a result a potential difference is generated in the photoreceptor cells, and this produces a signal that generates action potential in the ganglion cells through the bipolar cells. And these action potentials or impulses, they are transmitted through the optic nerves to the visual centers or cortex areas of the brain, where the neural impulses are analyzed and the image formed on the retina is recognized based on the earlier memory and experience.